When you hear the word urban street, what kind of image comes into mind? Is it something like this? No, not really. How about this? Yeah, this is more like it, right? 2 to 4 traffic lanes in the middle, 2 parking stripes, and then 2 sidewalks shoved under the buildings. This is a typical street in the developed world in the 21st century. But how come urban planning this radical could become so commonplace? Wait, what? Radical? Yes. What you see in front of you right now is the height of radicalism. It's a type of insanity that we just all kinda got used to over the years and never really stopped to consider its implications. It's also a very recent development, yet we all treat it as if some eternal status quo. Now, do you see what I'm talking about? Let's do it this way. For you as a living, breathing human being, red is off limits, only green is for you. In an urban settlement built for human beings to live, you as a human being are banned from most of the public spaces. Think about that for a moment. Let that sink in. Inside your city, you are banned from using most public spaces. And the only way you can use those spaces again is if you purchase a motor vehicle. And this is something very new. For as long as human settlements have existed, our streets used to be places of public congregation with additional transportation. Streets were places for us to socialize, to talk, walk, drink, eat, shop, hang out. In other words, to live our lives. This was the case for thousands of years, until about 100 years ago, the early 20th century. At that point, cars started to become more and more accessible. Although nowhere near on today's level, the vast majority of people were not car owners, and they weren't going to be either for a good while. Streets were for people still, the vast majority of people. But then, something happened. Something that was as ingenious as it was sinister. An instance of manufactured consent, so well executed it would put John Arbuckle's 1994 to shame. And the end result is you, looking out of your window, surveying this radical change, this fundamental shift which is contrary to human nature, and think nothing of it. How did this happen? Who was responsible? And what can we do to fix this mess? 100 or so years ago, in the 1920s, cars began to appear on the streets in greater and greater numbers. And by virtue of being a new and expensive technovolty, it was mostly wealthy people who owned them. And keep in mind that traffic rules as we know them today didn't exist yet. The way you drove was completely up to you. So we have a bunch of wealthy assholes in expensive and fast cars with no traffic rules driving onto pedestrian streets. And so predictably, the result was a massive death toll. The result of a phenomenon which later came to be called joyriding. And believe it or not, the public was staunchly anti-car at this point. So car manufacturers had a big problem. Their cars were being portrayed as these murderous death machines, which they pretty much were at this point, and the consequences of this bad PR was a threat to the automaker's bottom line. So what can they do? They can't really change people's minds at this point. The obvious and negative consequences of motorization were there for anyone to see. And that was when players of the auto industry came up with an idea. An idea that was just as insidious as it was genius and effective. Their targets became your grandparents or great-grandparents, depending on how old you are. At that point, they were school age still, and they started receiving a new type of education, courtesy of the auto industry and their endless benevolence. For the sake of their safety, children are thought to always look around before crossing the road, because they are the ones who have to stop for traffic and not the other way around. And that's because streets belong to cars, not people. And so entire generations of children grew up thinking this was the new norm. And this is the reason why even today, our streets belong to cars and not people. All of it can be traced back to the auto industry, with corporations using their wealth and power to subvert the democratic will of the people. Even today, in the 21st century, our streets are designed to serve corporate interest and not the people. For the sake of individualized transport and massive corporate profits, we are forced to endure all the negative consequences. The traffic hazard, the air pollution, the noise pollution, the loss of public space. These are all very bad things. And guess who's not suffering from them? But health, space, and environmental consequences are not the only ones we suffer from. There's also a social aspect, also known as atomization. As I've mentioned before, streets used to be places of public congregation and socialization, right until cars took it over. And it was COVID-19 that really highlighted this problem. As soon as we didn't have the restaurants, the bars, the clubs, the yoga classes, many people became completely isolated, with no opportunities to meet others. Before the era of motorization, you would have known people from the street, people living in your neighborhood, that is, because streets were places to hang out in, to stroll around, to do your thing, to have conversations with people, to socialize. But nowadays, with all the noise, the pollution, the crammed, narrow sidewalks, streets became this temporary unpleasantness that we have to trudge through to get to the nice places, and all because we gave our streets to cars.
Suburbs are built for, and result in, driving over every other form of transportation. If you've ever lived in a modern American suburb, you'll know that your entire life cycle is dominated by driving. You have to drive to get to school as a kid, then to work as an adult. Across the entire US, 76% of Americans get to work by driving alone. In general, Americans drive much more than people in nearly any other country. 17% more than Canadians, 44% more than Germans, and 141% more than the Japanese. Finally, contemporary suburban streets are just really nasty if you're a pedestrian. We don't even have to leave the country to compare this one. We can just compare older and newer American suburbs. This is a street in Royal Oak, an older suburb near the city of Detroit. It has sidewalks on both sides, and dense tree cover shelters people from the wind and the sun. The road is fairly narrow, and made more so by street parking, encouraging drivers to slow down. Many older urban residential areas, such as Chicago's Ukrainian Village pictured here, crank all these features up to 11. Compare this to a more recent suburb, once again in Canton to the west of Detroit. The street is much wider, and sidewalks fewer. There are no trees to protect you from the elements. Evidence suggests that many of these minor features are actually really important. The study I cited earlier about kids walking to school also found that, even controlling for distance, kids were more likely to walk to school if the route had sidewalks, was relatively dense, and had a continuous facade of buildings rather than widely interspersed houses. So, long story short, if you want to get anywhere in an American suburb, even just a few hundred feet over, you often have to drive. Which is really unfortunate, because not only is driving horribly expensive, as I explained last time, but it's really dangerous. A study out of Northwestern found that driving and motorcycling were by far the most dangerous ways to get around, with driving 17 times more deadly per passenger mile than commuter trains, 30 times more deadly than rail mass transit, and 66 times more deadly than the bus. In fact, cars directly kill nearly 40,000 people every year, including thousands of bicyclists and pedestrians in the US alone. A 2018 study found that car accidents were the leading cause of death of children in the United States, occurring at a much higher rate than any other developed country. And even that is a huge improvement compared to 20 years ago. Importantly, it's not just a matter of how much people drive, but how they drive. And as I alluded to earlier, today we build suburbs in ways that encourage really aggressive driving. Time and again, studies have found that the best way to slow traffic is to physically constrict the road to give drivers less room to navigate. For a good example, let's look at this recently activated street in northern Chicago. Designers widened the sidewalks and constrained the road across the entire stretch, and further narrowed it at intersections to slow drivers down even more. New York City is starting to implement these measures too, and in a city where over 100 pedestrians are killed by cars every year, it can't come fast enough. Unfortunately, suburban planning is generally going in the other direction, making suburbs unwalkable by spreading everything out, god-awful street design, and just sheer late capitalist ugliness. Sidewalks are rare, and streets are way too wide. One study found that even a modest increase in suburban street width, from 24 to 36 feet, made the road 4 times as dangerous, mostly because it encouraged drivers to go much faster. Ironically, it seems that modern suburban streets were designed wide with safety in mind, namely, easy access for emergency vehicles and easy evacuation during a nuclear event. Wide suburban streets, quote, try to minimize emergency response time without considering that the resulting wide streets lead to an increased number of traffic accidents, unquote. Driving is already by far the most dangerous transit mode out there per mile, and since you can't really walk, bike, or take transit around much of this country, it leaves people with no choice but to climb into the most dangerous options several times a day. So, suburbs kill us directly. A lot. Proportionally, the US has many more traffic deaths than other rich but otherwise less suburban countries. But there's a more insidious way they ruin our health as well. Walking sucks in the suburbs, and so, it's no coincidence that less than half of Americans get the 30 minutes of daily exercise recommended by medical experts, a requirement that can be met simply by walking. It's also no coincidence that, according to a 2018 CDC report, by far the most active American region was the District of Columbia, which is almost entirely urban. One study found that, while it's generally recommended that people get 150 minutes of moderate exercise a week, even getting only half of that through walking was already linked with much lower mortality, and reduced risk of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, and reduced risk of cancer, even after controlling for age, education, BMI, race, diet, and many other factors. But many Americans don't even get that, and there's plenty of research suggesting that suburbs are to blame. Let's look at some evidence. One 2014 study found that nearly everywhere, quote, automobile dependency and longer commuting are associated with the current obesity epidemic. Controlling for demographics and socioeconomic factors, those that drove a lot were generally more overweight and at risk of other health problems. The Seattle study I mentioned earlier took a more specific approach, and found that in the most walkable neighborhoods, people walked an extra 200 minutes a week, and had significantly lower BMI compared to the most car-oriented neighborhoods, even controlling for other factors. In the most walkable neighborhoods, the vast majority of residents got those 30 minutes of daily exercise, versus less than half for those in the most car-friendly neighborhoods. Even a mediocre walking environment more than doubled how much people walked per week versus the low walkability neighborhoods. How you get to work is also important. A slew of studies have found that both biking and walking to work are associated with healthier weights. But curiously, those studies also found that people that took public transit also tended to be healthier, controlling for other variables. This isn't just true in cities. A 2009 study found that among rural people in Japan, car use competed with physical activity, while access to public transport actually increased it. In fact, both rural and urban areas seem to be better for health and physical activity than suburban living. In one study, rural areas were the only spaces where greater automobile use wasn't associated with higher rates of obesity. But while those in the city often have a choice to walk, bike, or take transit, many suburbanites don't have any of those options. Anyways, that rural pattern extends to children as well. Rural kids were the most active, followed by urban kids, with those growing up in the suburbs being the most sedentary, according to a 2014 study. No matter if you're young or old, suburbs seem to be the absolute worst place to live if you want to stay in shape. We've actually been making the suburbs worse for walking. Remember Old Royal Oak and New Canton? A 2002 study found that, controlling for demographics, people living in older neighborhoods, specifically those built before 1973, were much more likely to frequently walk than those living in newer suburbs. Importantly, the authors found that home age was not correlated with preference for exercise in general, so it's not just that older neighborhoods are packed with joggers and health nuts. There's something about newer suburbs themselves that make people hate walking. Another study that looked specifically at teenagers found that those living in older suburbs were more likely to be active than those living in newer suburbs, even when controlling for socioeconomic factors, race, and age. There's 100 other ways that suburbs hurt the health of those living in them. I haven't talked about car pollution, but I do want to end on a positive note. Making our suburbs healthier and more walkable may seem like an insurmountable task, requiring us to demolish everything and start from scratch. But even small interventions can help. A 2006 review found that modifying just a few blocks of a suburb to make it walkable and pleasant dramatically increased physical activity in the surrounding areas. Giving people a good walking destination, even a small one, was enough to motivate walking and street life. Even cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen, where a majority of people get to work by foot or by bike today, used to be choked by cars. Many older towns in the US do have a main street that's easy to reclaim, just as those cities did. If a city like Detroit can improve, then anybody can.
I want to demonstrate to you the mindset of designers as they build the streets that we walk and bike and to a great extent drive on within our urban areas. This is the base of a traffic signal. So if you are going to cross this street, the designer of this has built-in feature that you will, as a human being outside of a vehicle, walk up to this pedestal and press a button, and then stand there on the edge of the roadway and wait your turn to cross while traffic goes through this intersection, right? I just explained to you how every city intersection works, right? I want you to look very closely at the base of this pole. And I want you to look, I'm going to take a side shot of it right here. I want you to look at it right there, and you can see there's this weird configuration where the pole is actually not connected to the pedestal. There's a gap in there. And if you look in there, there's some screws. What is going on with this? Those screws are called shear pins. And the reason that they're there is because this pole is designed to shear off if a vehicle comes and hits it. If a vehicle comes flying off the roadway and hits that pole, the pole is designed not to be a stable stop thing that they'll run into and have a traumatic injury. The pole is designed to give way and to essentially gently collapse and absorb that kinetic energy to spare the driver the trauma of the abrupt stop. The reason that is put in is because enough drivers were going off the road in these kind of areas, striking these poles and dying or having traumatic brain injuries. And so the engineers, the designers have gone in and designed systems that break away. Again, where are you standing in this scenario? Where are you positioned? And not just like where are you positioned theoretically, where does the same person who designs the breakaway nature of that pole, the same person who acknowledges that vehicles are going to be traveling at such high speeds and experience such trauma if they hit this pole, the same person who goes through that process to design that has also gone through a process to put you right there at the same time. What does that say about the system, right? There's a term that lawyers use for gross negligence. And gross negligence, in a legal definition in the US, means a conscious indifference to the safety of others. We have acknowledged, and we're very sensitive to, as designers, the trauma that the driver will suffer by hitting the pole. We are consciously indifferent. We have made an intentional decision to be indifferent to the trauma suffered by the person standing at the pole where we expect them to be. This is backward. And it's a complete reversal of what we know and what I think the great insights of the transportation profession
Moved
are.
to Amsterdam in 2018, the municipal elections had just finished. One of the political parties is GroenLinks, basically the local Green Party. As part of their election platform, they promised to remove 10,000 parking spaces from the streets of Amsterdam by 2025. But of course, when the election was held, they won a landslide victory. Well, as much of a landslide as you can have in an election with over a dozen parties. They're the light green on this map. This was quite a difference for us, having just moved from a city where a major election promise was to spend about half of the entire transportation services budget, over $3.6 billion, to rebuild a single 1960s elevated expressway through downtown. Well, the rest of the roads looked like this. Car infrastructure is horrendously expensive. But anyway, election promises are one thing. What's the reality? Did Amsterdam really remove thousands of parking spaces? Well, yes, they did. And it's pretty great. Well, mostly. I followed urban planning issues across many cities for many years, and one of the things that's almost universal is that removing parking is contentious. After the motorific 20th century, car owners are very, very, very entitled and feel that they're owed cheap or even free parking everywhere they go. But parking generates a lot of problems too, so many cities are trying to reduce it. That's easier said than done though, and as the saying goes, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And boy are drivers ever privileged, even in Amsterdam. Look at a typical street like this one. In Amsterdam, only about 40% of households have a car, but you'd never know it by looking at this. Almost every street is lined with parked cars, which means that a minority of people are consuming a majority of the public space that could be used for more productive purposes. Unfortunately, street parking brings with it a lot of problems. Besides being ugly and taking up too much space, street parking can be dangerous too. A line of parked cars reduces the visibility of side streets, leading to predictable crashes, and cars coming out of parking spaces results in an increase in crashes too. And anyone cycling along a street like this is at risk of serious injury or even death if any one of these drivers opens their car door without looking. Drivers getting in and out of parking spaces also disrupt traffic, which worsens congestion on the street. On commercial streets, it's often argued that street parking is necessary for businesses, but the math doesn't really add up. There's only space for 1 or 2 cars outside of most shops, and even if these spots are turning over every 30 minutes or so, which they're not, there's no way this can bring in enough revenue to make a substantial difference to most businesses. City Beautiful made an excellent video recently where he talks, among other things, about the revenue potential of commercial street parking spaces. In most cases, replacing street parking within a city with, say, a protected bicycle lane is almost always better financially. For example, during COVID, Toronto converted many of its street parking spaces into extra restaurant seating, and a recent analysis showed those patios brought in almost 50 times as much money as the parking fees they replaced. Another problem with street parking is that it's usually far too cheap, so it gets occupied quickly. There have been studies showing that in some neighborhoods, 30 to 40% of all traffic was just drivers cruising to find cheap street parking. To deal with this, you'd ideally want to increase the cost of street parking to match demand, and San Francisco tried this with their SF Park experiment, which automatically changed the price of street parking to maintain a 60 to 80% occupancy rate. This experiment worked brilliantly and was beneficial in almost every way, but drivers complained about the uncertainty of how much it would cost to park. And that's in addition to the typical whinging about price from entitled drivers, but we already knew that would happen. So a flat rate is generally more accepted, and here in Amsterdam, street parking prices were increased across the city. For example, it now costs €7.50 per hour to park in the city centre. But that doesn't really get rid of the parking spaces, it just reduces their demand. In most cities, street parking is just an accepted reality. We have come to expect that almost every street is lined with parked cars. But does it really have to be this way? Japanese cities took a very different approach. Here in Tokyo, for example, there is very limited street parking, and the maximum time is usually only 1 hour or less. Most importantly, it's forbidden to park your car on the street overnight. Japan also has a proof of parking rule. If you want to buy a car, you need to prove that you have an off-street parking space for it in order to get it licensed. This is why Japanese streets look the way they do. They can get away with much narrower streets because there's no need to accommodate car parking. On a street like this, all traffic can mix together because speeds are so slow here. This is also why so many people ride bicycles in Japan despite there being very little bicycle infrastructure. These slow, narrow streets are already safe enough for many people. But come on guys, you gotta do better on big roads like this. So removing street parking can significantly improve the look and feel of a city and makes it easier to build great urban places. Of course, whenever a proposal is made to reduce car parking, many people start listing off a long list of reasons why street parking is absolutely essential and can never be removed. But let's be honest, most of the time this is just concern trolling. The people making these arguments don't actually care about the reasons they cite, they just want to keep every possible parking space, but they know saying that out loud makes them sound like an entitled jerk. But there are legitimate reasons to park a motor vehicle sometimes, and Amsterdam has exceptions for many of these cases. For example, on a street like this, there are designated spots for loading and unloading, and despite the picture showing a truck, you can park your personal vehicle here too, for that one time of year you actually use all that space in your SUV. There are also spots for car share cars, which are great and becoming increasingly popular in Amsterdam, and I talked about that in a previous video. There are also shared cargo bikes like this one, which I like even more because so many trips that people think require a car can be done quite easily with a cargo bike. And there are some designated spots for disabled parking too, though Amsterdam also does a lot to ensure that people with physical disabilities can get around in other ways, which can increase their independent mobility, because what most people fail to acknowledge is that a huge percentage of the disabled population can't drive. So after taking all of this into account, this is what it looks like. This shows that it is possible to cover the corner cases needed for car parking without having to line every street with ugly metal boxes. By now you may be thinking, how did Amsterdam actually pull this off? Did they just dump all the cars into a canal and call it a day? Well, no, not exactly. They've actually tested several methods in different parts of the city. The most common method is attrition. Every street parking space requires a permit, so as people give up their parking permits, for example because they've sold their car or moved out of the city just doesn't grant a new permit. So over time, the problem just works itself out. So that frees up around 1,000 parking spaces per year, but that's not quite fast enough, so Amsterdam is trying other methods of speeding up the process. For example, Amsterdam is taking advantage of street redesigns in order to remove parking spaces. This is Koninginnenweg, a relatively busy street in Amsterdam Zuid. When this construction is completed, it will be much safer, especially for people cycling, and it will be reconstructed with around 140 fewer parking spaces. And I featured this street, Kinkerstraat, in my Most Dangerous Places to Cycle in Amsterdam video. This redesign will provide much more room for people cycling and will also remove 27 parking spaces in the process. There are many other construction projects underway across the city, and wherever possible, the street is rebuilt with fewer parking spaces than before. This is Oude Wal, which literally just means old wall. A really clever name there, guys. All street parking has been removed along the canal here. Presumably, this will be redesigned in the future, but in the meantime, residents have installed their own planters and decorations. I love seeing this parking payment machine stranded here. So this gets rid of a few more parking spaces, but it's still not enough to get to 10,000 spaces, so the city is trying other methods of removing parking more quickly. One trial was attempted on this street in Amsterdam Oost. In 2019, all of the parking was removed and there were temporary planters and bike parking installed. The idea here is that residents would love the new street so much they wouldn't want the cars to return. For some streets this can work, but it needs the buy-in from the majority of residents. For now, the trial is over and the street is back to the way it was before. That doesn't mean that it was a failure though, it's just the end of the trial. There are plans in the works for a redesign of this neighborhood, so maybe that'll have to be a future video. Another method was attempted here in the streets along the Frans Halstraat in De Pijp. Here, street parking was removed in the whole neighborhood all at once. The space was used for more trees and greenery, lots of bicycle parking, small playgrounds, and other uses. This current design is temporary, but plans are moving ahead for a permanent design, and I'll definitely cover this in a future video when this work completes. The result of this transformation is incredible. Look at this street. It feels busy and claustrophobic. Now compare it to this. This street looks large and inviting. But this is exactly the same street, only a few meters away. I've come through here dozens of times, but it never ceases to amaze me. What an incredible difference it makes to get rid of the cars. So where do the cars go? Well, they're right here. No, not in the water.
God, that's good B-roll.
A multi-level parking garage was built under this canal that has space for all the removed cars, and then some. This is a pretty great parking garage, and it has a huge number of electric car charging spots as well, which makes me wonder just how much electrical current this garage would pull if all of these spots were in use at once. There is bike parking too, but only space for 60 bicycles. It's clear that residents are expected to park their bicycles in the space freed up on the street. So this is great, right? The streets are so obviously better, and this is now one of my favorite neighborhoods in the city. 300 parking spaces were removed to make these streets as great as they are. But this parking garage has space for 600 cars. And it costs 35 million euros, which is almost 60,000 euros per spot. But the residents who live nearby can get a parking space in this garage for the same cost as regular street parking. That's a pretty big subsidy to drivers. As a point of reference, Amsterdam only spends about 70 million per year on bicycle infrastructure, so this one parking garage is equivalent to half the entire cycling budget for a whole year. As usual, car infrastructure is horrendously expensive. But back to the topic at hand. If 300 parking spaces were removed on the street, but 600 were added in the garage, does this count as removing 300 spaces or adding 300 spaces? Well, it turns out the goal of removing 10,000 parking spaces is only referring to on-street parking spaces, so this still counts as 300 removed spaces. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still a really great goal. There are many good reasons for removing on-street parking, and the less of it we have in our cities, the better. But off-street parking causes a lot of problems for cities too. Actually, Climate Town has a great video about this. You want to comment on that, Rolly?
Hey, it's done. The video's all done and nailed it. Check it out on the Climate Town YouTube page. Back to you, Jason.
Anyway, the biggest issue here is that the more parking you have, the more driving you have, and I've heard anecdotally that people in this neighborhood are now more likely to drive because of this parking garage. Before the garage was built, the limited parking on street would discourage people from taking their car as they might not be guaranteed a good spot when they returned. But now that the garage has been built, people are more likely to take their car, even for short trips. One fundamental problem with Amsterdam is that the city center is just not good. Yes, I know it's crawling with tourists and has too many waffle shops, and waffles aren't even Dutch, people, but that's not what I'm talking about. If you look at almost any other city in the Netherlands or even Germany, the city center has a pedestrianized area. Heck, Brussels, which is a place I try to forget I lived in, has significantly expanded their pedestrianized city center in recent years. Unfortunately, Amsterdam only has a handful of pedestrianized streets, and cars are allowed pretty much everywhere in the city center. And so every weekend, you get this line of cars coming into the 17th century canal ring. If there's one thing I've learned from visiting hundreds of cities around the world, it's that the vast majority of people will take whatever transportation method is the fastest and most convenient. If you make trains the most convenient, then most people will take the train. And if you make cars the most convenient, then most people will drive. But as with any rule, there are always exceptions. For example, there are some people who will choose to ride a bicycle, even though that's a completely illogical and even dangerous thing to do because the roads were not designed for it. And similarly, there are some people who, no matter how painful and inconvenient it is, will insist on driving, even though the city center is not designed for it. Unfortunately, the people who insist on driving create a lot of problems for everyone else because they take up a huge amount of space and make the streets more dangerous for everybody who isn't inside of a metal box. Now, this is about the time the driving apologists will chime in claiming that all of these people have to drive because they have no other choice and need a car for some reason. Thankfully, the NRC actually stopped and asked people why they were driving into the city center. Were they all bringing their poor disabled mothers out to the canals for a sunny Sunday? No. They were just driving because that's what they felt like doing. One group said they were at the Amsterdam Rai Convention Center, a place with one of the best park and ride garages in the entire city, and a direct metro line that literally brings you right to this location within 5 minutes. Instead, they sat in traffic for an hour and a half to get here. There was only one guy they interviewed who really needed to drive because he was helping his son move into a new apartment. Of course, he had to sit in traffic that shouldn't have even been there if these people had just taken the metro like everyone else. Do normal, jongens. The majority of this traffic every weekend comes from people shopping, especially at the Bijenkorf, a high-end department store. And what allows these people to do this is this parking garage, which holds over 400 cars. This is a textbook example of parking generating traffic. As long as this Q Park garage is here, there will be people wanting to use it. Thankfully, Amsterdam is starting to do more to reduce car access to the city center. 1 block away from this dumpster fire is this street, recently converted into a small park. It even has grassy tram tracks, my favorite. Here's what it looked like before. It's amazing to see what can be done with a huge amount of space normally consumed by cars. There is still some work underway here, but when all the work is done, there will be 77 fewer parking spaces along this street. So far, Amsterdam has removed over 4,000 parking spaces with a few years to go until 2025. As some of these construction projects complete, this number should increase quickly, though time will tell if they reach the original 10,000 target. These changes will make a hugely positive impact on streetscapes all across the city, and while removing street parking is not a full solution, it's still a big step in the right direction. Now the next step, let's turn this ugly thing into housing.